Joining me now is former foreign policy advisor to President Ronald Reagan, former ambassador to Costa Rica, and now author, Ambassador Curtin Winsor Jr. Ambassador, thanks for being here today.
It's a pleasure, Liz. Thank you.
All right, Ambassador, we heard the Taliban warned that they were going to begin a spring offensive. What's their objective here?
I think their objective is to destabilize a relatively fragile government. As many of our readers, your listeners probably know, Afghanistan is essentially a tribal entity. It's not truly or easily described as a country. It does have a government we've set up, and they're doing the best they can to resist an onslaught by elements that take basically an evil side of a religion and translate it into terrorism. They're supported by the Pakistanis, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. That you ask the questions.
All right, we hear that this city, that Kabul is heavily fortified. First of all, what does that mean? And then secondly, is the city secure? Because they just suffered this suicide attack.
It would be very hard to characterize it as secure, even though the various important points around the city will have rings of protection. And it's very hard to guard against a suicide attacker armed with a truck and tons of explosives. Even in the United States, it would be hard to do, although I think we're much better suited than they are for it. But the problem that you have in Afghanistan is that it's very, very hard to know what people's loyalties are, often from week to week or even day to day, given the rather desperate situation of a lot of the people in that country.
All right, let me ask you this. Let's switch topics here for a moment and talk about Guantanamo Bay, the military prison in Cuba, Gitmo. Recently, the United States government has released 9 detainees from Gitmo, sent them back to Saudi Arabia. Ambassador, what are your thoughts on this? This has been a highly politicized, highly controversial move by the Obama administration.
Well, of course, they've politicized Guantanamo from the beginning. And Guantanamo is, for the most part today, a collection of extremely dangerous people. The ideological difference between the ISIL, or for that matter, even the Taliban and the Wahhabis, which are the dominant religious group in Saudi Arabia, it's the form of Sunni Islam that dominates Saudi Arabia, is almost negligible. They believe basically in terrorism as a form of warfare, and they call it jihadism. Jihadism, some people try to pretend, means intellectual struggle. It doesn't. It means armed struggle, and it has always meant that.
Well, what's Saudi Arabia going to do then to prevent these terrorists from returning to the battlefield? Because we've seen this happen already. This isn't a prediction. This isn't a scare tactic. We've seen detainees released from Gitmo that go back to the battlefield and fight against us. Is Saudi Arabia going to do anything to prevent that?
Saudi Arabia is very conflicted. It's a complex country. It is dominated by what I could only call an extremist ideological form of Islam, which condones terrorism. That they would take these people you would think immediately bode ill, but they are now themselves under threat from ISIL and from extremist elements. And the royal family itself is somewhat divided in Saudi Arabia. So at the risk of sounding confusing, let me say that Saudi Arabia is a confused place, but it's a very important place. It's a place which has become very important to American and Americans' friends as a source of oil. But it also is, it has been spending billions of dollars, maybe as much as $100 billion over the last few years, since 1990 at least, radicalizing Islam, creating jihadists out of Islam, preferably jihadists that are pointed away from Saudi Arabia.
Right, and you talk about Saudi Arabia creating radical Islamist terrorists, and right at this time, we have Senator Bob Graham from Florida claiming that the hijackers of 9/11, of September 11th, received money from the Saudi government. Do you think that's accurate, Ambassador?
It's partly accurate. My bet is the money did not come from the Saudi government. My bet is that it would have come from wealthy families, many of whom have links to the government. But the government itself would be too smart to have done that. You have incredibly wealthy people, most of whom contributed this huge amount of money that I was talking about for the spread of radical or jihadist Islam. And these people are probably the ones who directly or indirectly funded what happened at 9/11. That I don't doubt.
Well, if these wealthy individuals did help fund the attacks on 9/11, and even if they're not directly correlated with the government, if they have ties to the government, should the Saudi government be held accountable in some way?
That's an iffy question, but the answer is to some extent yes, because there's probably an overlap there. But remember, these individuals, I'll bet, own property in the West, large amounts of property. So the issue of suing a sovereign government always gets very complicated, and the Obama administration delights, I think, in telling us how we couldn't do that. We may not have to if we're talking about elements like the bin Laden family, the family of the late unlamented Osama bin Laden, were in fact the people who funded this, and very likely they and their friends were.
All right, and we know that confrontation or standing up for America isn't President Obama's strong suit, but that's a topic for a different day. Ambassador, we're almost out of time, but let me ask you one last question. There's been a lot of talk lately about the 28 pages of the 9/11 Commission report that are currently classified, and there are people that are calling for them to be declassified. In your opinion, is that a good idea?
Yes, because I think basically the people of the United States have a right to know that a country that all too many people, and not just Obama, have called our most reliable ally, is in many ways our worst enemy. Saudi Arabia is both a friend, but the kind of friend that you need, who would be an excellent enemy as well.
A trust but verify friend, if you will.
At best. At best.
Right, and
because
that
they
speaks to the
basically helped
confusion.
us in the 70s.
That speaks to the confusion that you talked about before, that there's conflict within the powers that be in their own country. Ambassador, I appreciate your insight on these topics. It was very interesting to talk to you. I appreciate you coming on the show today. Coming up, Bernie Sanders surrogate Rosario Dawson claims that Donald Trump's a horrible person for wanting to build a wall, but she claims Hillary's a horrible person too for supporting a wall around Israel. Jonathan Harris is here next.